Hi, my name is Janine Bijsterbos. Welcome to this practical on resting state data analysis using the network modeling approach as implemented in FSLNETS. This practical is going to be a little bit different from the other practicals in the FSL course because instead of using the normal command line or FSL GUIs, we are going to be working in Octave, which is a free version of MATLAB. You can also perform this practical in MATLAB if you prefer. I'm going to be showing you some of the sections within Amazon Workspace, and I'm also going to be linking some of the topics that we discussed back to the recordings of the lecture episodes. The first section of this practical talks us through some of the steps that we need to perform before running FSLNETS. These boxes are in red because we don't recommend that you run these as part of the practical. They take a while to run and you just be sitting there not being able to do anything at all. So we've already performed these steps for you. As you can see, we define the nodes using melodic and then extract the time series using this command called dual regression. Going back to the lecture, this relates to the topics that we discussed in the second episode of the lecture. Given that we're using melodic or ICA in order to define our nodes, that means that our nodes are going to be non-contiguous and our nodes are going to be weighted, i.e. we're working with a soft parcellation here in terms of node characteristics. In addition, this means that we're doing a data-driven parcellation instead of using a functional atlas. The steps that we are going to be working through in the practical talk us through how to estimate the edges. And we're going to look at the difference between full and partial correlation. To start up, let's open up Octave. This box in gray means that we have to run this command in the command line. So I can copy and paste this across. As you can see from the prompt having changed, we are now working in the Octave environment. All of the other commands that you can see here in the practical instructions are in orange boxes, which means that these commands should be run within Octave or within MATLAB. And again, we can just copy and paste these across. This first command is just setting up some of the paths and loading up some of the packages that we're going to be using in this practical. The next section of the practical talks us through how to estimate the network matrix using different types of edges. The first step here loads all of the data into the Octave workspace. This data includes all subjects and all nodes and one time series for each node for each subject. Now that we've loaded this data into the Octave workspace, we can try and interrogate it. So for example, we can type field names TS. And this tells us that TS is a structure that contains a number of different elements within that. These elements include the number of subjects, the number of nodes, and the TS, which is the main data set that we'll be working with. Several of the commands that we'll be running in this practical will create figures for us to look at. For example, I just ran this net spectra command here. The figures in this practical are a little bit different than some of the other maps that we've looked at in other practicals. Here we won't be interacting with fossilized to open up images of brain maps because remember, we're not working at the level of the brain anymore. This is a node-based analysis, so we are looking at the characteristics of the time series of nodes, as for example in this net spectra map, or later on in the practical we're looking at edges. Because the figures are a little bit different, the practical does include information where you can learn a little bit more about how to understand the figures. You can click on these points called click here for more information on how to read the figure, and it will open up an example of the figure for you that has been annotated to explain what some of the different elements mean. We encourage you to look at this and think about it, but also this is a really good opportunity to interact with the tutors. You really do learn the most from these practicals by chatting to the tutors and asking them lots of questions. And so if there's some part of the figure that you don't understand, or if you do understand the figure but you're not quite sure how it relates to the analysis that you're doing or anything else, please do ask one of the tutors. This next section talks about cleaning up the components or the nodes. This is because when we do a data-driven node definition using, for example, ICA, some of our nodes might not actually be in signal regions. And this is even after careful pre-processing of individual subject data. As we discussed in the first episode of this lecture, the data that we're using here have been carefully pre-processed. However, when you combine data across multiple subjects into a group level ICA analysis, you might have increased sensitivity to pick up on remaining noise that was not removed during the preprocessing. What this command is doing is it's first of all defining which node numbers should be labeled as signal and should be kept for the rest of the analysis. And then using this command called nets ts clean, it is removing the data from those nodes that have not been labeled as clean. In this next section of the practical, we're calculating all of the edges and generating the network matrices, or netmats, for each subject. As you can see in this box here, we're running the nets netmats command twice. The first time to generate full network matrices using full correlation, and the second command generates a partial correlation matrix. Here we're implementing a little bit of regularization using ridge regression. If you remember, regularization was something that we discussed as part of the lecture, as you can see here. Once we've created the network matrices that contain all of the edges for all of the subjects, we can look at some group average summaries. This first command here is going to generate the group averages and plot one of them, the second one. And then we're going to, down here, plot the nets hierarchy command. This relates to episode 3 of the lecture, where we talked about group level analysis. The nets hierarchy command is implementing this hierarchical clustering approach that we saw on this slide here. The next section of this practical looks at what types of statistical analyses you might do using network matrices to look at differences between subjects. When we run this nets glm command, what it's going to do is run a general linear model, the same ones that we've seen many times in the FSL course, separately for each of the edges, in order to test whether there's a significant difference between patients and controls on any of the edges. This result image that we get from running nets glm gives us the p-value, or in fact 1 minus the p-value, for each individual edge included in the analysis. And as you can see, most of the edges are blue, which means that they have a value of 0. Given that this figure is showing the results as 1 minus the p-value, that means that these edges had a p-value that was really high, close to 1. And therefore all of the blue edges here did not differ significantly between patients and controls. So as you can see, there's only a small number of edges that differ between patients and controls. For example, this one here that has a red value, meaning that the p-value was low, as this is showing a value that is higher up and closer to 1. All of these results have been controlled for multiple comparisons. The results below the diagonal in this triangle here have not been thresholded, so they show any values that showed up after multiple comparisons testing. The ones above the diagonal have been thresholded at p equals 0.05 after multiple comparisons correction. And so you can see there's one single edge that shows a difference between patients and controls after multiple comparison correction for all of the different edges included in this analysis. I should point out that we include a relatively small number of subjects here so that these analyses run relatively quickly for the practical. So it is not unsurprising that these findings are relatively underpowered. To interrogate this significant edge further, we can run the next command. The next two commands help us understand these results a little bit further. For example, the nets edge picks command shows which of the nodes were involved in the results that we found, and the next box plots results show us how the edge strength differed between patients and controls. The last section of this practical is optional. It shows an alternative approach for doing a group level analysis. Here, instead of doing a univariate general linear model approach where we run the same model separately for each individual edge, we are showing an example of a multivariate cross-subject analysis. Here we're using a machine learning approach that takes into account all of the different edges as features in the analysis to try and predict which subjects are patients and controls. So instead of drawing inferences about all of the separate edges, here we're trying to make as good a prediction as possible and achieve as good an accuracy in terms of labeling individual subjects as patients and controls using a multivariate approach. If this is something of interest to you, then definitely have a go at trying this. So to wrap up, please make sure to ask lots of questions from the tutors to understand this practical and the lecture better and any topics that are related to it. And thank you so much.